Hepiniz hoş geldiniz. İran İslam Devrimi 10 gün önce tam 40. yılını doldurdu. O günleri yaşayanlar anımsayacaktır. Devrimin hemen ardından İran-Irak Savaşı yaşanacak, 8 yıl sürecek ve bu savaşın ardından 1 milyon insan yaşamını yitirecekti. Lübnan sokakları 1975'ten itibaren 15 yıl boyunca yaşanan iç savaşta deyim yerinde ise bir kan gölüne dönmüştü. İsrail, Filistin 1948'den bugüne hala çatışma halindeler ve yakın bir gelecekte de bir barış umudu maalesef görünmüyor. 11 Eylül'den sonra Afganistan, Pakistan ve Irak'a yönelik operasyonlarda 500 bin Müslüman yaşamını yitirdi. Yemen'in bugün durumu içler acısı, büyük trajediler, büyük dramlar yaşanıyor. Ve Orta Doğu kaosunun son halkası Suriye'de bugüne kadar 600 bin masum sivil katledildi. Peki bu iş hep böyle mi olacak diye düşünüp bir analiz yaptığımızda hep o standart şablonlara ulaşıyoruz. Amerikan emperyalizmi, Batı'nın İslam coğrafyasına yönelik kültürel, iktisadi, siyasi ve askeri taarruzları. Bunlar doğru mu? Evet, bunlar gerçekten burada yaşanan sorunların merkezine konacak kadar büyük gerçekler. Ancak yine de tüm bu analizlerin sonucunda içimize sinmeyen, yerlerine oturmayan bazı şeyler kalıyor. Ben biraz çuvaldızı kendimize batırmak istiyorum bu akşam. Düşünün ki üzerinde bunca operasyon yapılan, kandırılan, kullanılan ve birbirlerine karşı savaştırılmak üzere resmen bir rampa olarak kullanılan bu devletler, bu uluslar, bu halklar, yeryüzünün en kadim ulusları, en deneyim sahibi ulusları. Savunma mekanizması ortaya koyamadılar. Bu gerçekten çok hüzünlü bir durum. Gerçekten akıl tutulması gibi de yorumlanabilir. Şöyle düşünebiliriz. Ben bunu bir kitapta okuduğumda gerçekten çok şaşırmıştım. Böylesine bir anlamsızlaşma sonucunda Orta Doğu'nun ve Müslümanların Kerbela'dan sonra lanetlendiğine inanan Müslümanlar dahi var. Bu akıl alır gibi değil ama bulunan zeminin ne kadar sıkıntılı olduğunu belki tarif etmek için bir örnek olarak ortaya konabilir. Bu işin bir tarafı. Çok kısaca değineceğim ve yıllardır gördüğüm bir paradoks daha var. Ona değinmeden geçemeyeceğim. Bu biraz Müslümanların Batı'yla kurduğu aşk ve nefret ilişkisinin de bir somutlaşması gibi düşünülebilir. Yıllardır büyük şeytan Amerika, kahrolsun Batı değerleri, Batı emperyalizmi ve Avrupa değerleri diye sloganlar atan her Müslüman kendi içinde yaşadığı, içinde bulunduğu sistemde bir sorun yaşadığında ilk soluğu gene Belçika, Fransa, İngiltere ya da Almanya'da alıyor. Bu akşam burada dinleme şansına sahip olacağımız konuğumuz Pakistan asıllı bir Müslüman oluşları, aynı zamanda doğma büyüme batılı oluşlarıyla iki dünyayı da çok iyi tanıyan ve çok nesnel bir analiz yapma imkanına, avantajına sahip bir isim. İş hayatında olduğu kadar akademik hayatlarında da zirveyi yakalamış bir insandan bahsediyoruz. Bu akşam burada bizimle olmak için çok uzun bir yoldan, Birleşik Devletler'den geldiler. Bu özverilerinden ve nezaketlerinden dolayı gerçekten kendilerine çok teşekkür ediyorum. Alkışlarınızla Azim İbrahim, hoş geldiniz.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, let me thank my hosts for giving me the opportunity to come here and speak to such a prestigious audience. I always enjoy my trips to Turkey, Istanbul and Ankara so significantly. It's a great honor for me to be here once again amongst my friends. My dear friends, there is a curse in China which says, may you live in interesting times. This is a curse. May you live in interesting times. We are not only living in interesting times, we are living in unprecedented times. Born today, all of you can expect to live 30 to 35 years longer than your Ottoman equivalents. It is highly unlikely that your birth will kill you. It is highly unlikely that you will die of typhoid, smallpox, plague, or fever. It's highly unlikely. We today have more access to knowledge in our pockets than Aristotle. We have the ability to travel further than Alexander the Great. The human race today is in an unprecedented situation in terms of progress. We have never looked better. This is the best situation that we have been in. According to the IMF, the International Poverty Fund, poverty globally is today at the lowest level it's ever been in history. Extreme poverty is defined by the IMF as people living on $1.90 a day. And this has gone down. In 2011, there was 268 million people, 268 million people living in extreme poverty. In 2018, 7 years later, this number is down to 50 million. This is unprecedented in human history. One of the principal reasons for this is because of China. China has managed to do something in 40 years that no nation has ever done in history. They have managed to pull out 250 million people out of abject poverty and into the middle class. This is without a doubt the best situation the human race has ever been in. But this progress is not shared amongst everybody. Whilst the entire human race is making progress, the Muslim world, on the other hand, has been in complete stagnation. The Muslim world is riddled with corruption, with oppression, with a victim mentality, and it is rife with conspiracy theories that blame other people. And I'm sure you've heard many of these. I have traveled extensively through the Muslim world, and I am still baffled by why people continue to believe these bizarre conspiracy theories. And I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago, the psychology of the Muslims who believe in these conspiracy theories. And I believe there's a number of reasons why they do. First of all, I think that Muslims, like any other person, they like to believe that there's order in the world. There's order in the world. There are rules in the world. Nobody likes to believe this is chaos. So when JFK, a historical figure like JFK is assassinated, there has to be a reason behind it. It cannot be somebody completely historically insignificant as Lee Harvey Oswald. When something like 9/11 happens, it has to be an inside job. It cannot be a man sitting in a cave in Afghanistan. So we like to believe that there's order in the world. We also like to believe we're special. You know, you and I, we know the truth. We know the truth of what's happening in the world. The rest of the world, they're all blind. They don't know anything. We're special. We know the truth. And finally, it also absolves us of any responsibility. You know, these forces, they're controlled. They're controlled by the CIA, they're controlled by Israel, they're controlled by the Jews. These are powerful forces that control the world. So what can I do? What can a little person like me do? I can't do anything against these big forces, so it's better if I do nothing. so it absolves us of all responsibility. This is the conspiracy mindset which is damaging the Muslim world. According to the World Bank, the Human Development Index, the Muslim nations are at the bottom of every social economic indicator. Every social economic indicator, Muslim countries are at the bottom. There are only a handful of African countries that are below the Muslim countries, but the Muslim countries are right at the bottom. The Muslim world produces less research, the entire Muslim world produces less research than Spain. Spain is a country that was called the sick man of Europe, and the entire Muslim world produces less than Spain. And this isn't just exclusive to the Muslim world. Even Muslims living in the West are suffering from this stagnation. Muslims in the West, in the United Kingdom, the country of my birth, Muslims are the least educated and the least in professional jobs, those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi background. We also make up a disproportionate number of prisoners in the West. For example, in France, 8% of the population is Muslim, 8%, but they make up 70% of the prison population. In the UK, Muslims are 5% of the population, but they make up 44% of the prison population. And in the United States, we're approximately 1% of the population, and we make up over 7% of the prisons. So it is very clear Muslims are simply not performing on the global stage. And I can tell you an entire litany of reasons why that is the case. Why aren't Muslims performing to their same standards as other counterparts? But we don't have all day for this. So I will just focus on two topics on which were the topics of my last two books. One of them is extremism, Islamic extremism, and the other is the humanitarian crisis that's facing the Muslim world. One of them is long-term. It's a generational battle. Extremism, tackling extremist ideologies. And the other, humanitarian, is a short-term, urgent crisis. Like many of you, and there's many policymakers amongst you, and I'm sure you've had this conversation with your counterparts when you travel to Washington or Europe or elsewhere, I also am very tired of telling Western policymakers, Western academics, Western journalists, and anybody else that I may interact with, that look, what is happening on the news, what is happening at Al-Qaeda or Daesh, ISIS, this is not representative of Islam. You know, Islam is a religion of peace, and these people are not representing Islam whatsoever. But despite all the efforts, Islam is still viewed very negatively in the entire globe. 61% of Americans, 61%, so the majority of them, believe that Islam has a detrimental effect on humanity. 61%. So why is that the case? Why is that the case when we are all arguing that, look, this is not representative of Islam and these people are getting disproportionate media coverage? The media focuses too much on these people, and we Muslims, we actually look at, you know, when the majority of us are peaceful, loving people. These people are less than 0.1%. Why is that the case? For this, we have to look at the evidence. Evidence has to inform our thinking. The Global Terrorist Index of 2017, the Global Terrorist Index is an index created by the University of Maryland along with the Department of US Homeland Security. It is regarded as the most detailed and extensive index and documentation of terrorist acts around the globe. The Global Terrorism Index essentially says, from 2017, there are 10 countries in the world that are responsible for all the terrorism. 10 countries. Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and Iraq. 10 countries responsible for all the terrorism in the world. Out of those 10, only 2 are not Muslim majority countries, India and Nigeria. Nigeria is 45% Muslim, so it's almost Muslim majority. India is 15% Muslim, and the only organization that is doing more terrorism in India is the Maoist rebels. This is very telling. 10 countries, 8 of them are Muslim majority, are responsible for all the terrorism in the world. The Global Terrorism Index also tells us that there have been recorded 274 terrorist organizations in the world, 274, and that are responsible for terrorism all over the world. But 4 of them are responsible for 74% of all the terrorism. 4 organizations out of 274 are responsible for 74. So 3/4 of all the terrorism is caused by 4 organizations. Those organizations are ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Boko Haram. All of them claim to be Muslim organizations. So this is the evidence. So we can talk as much as we want about Islam being peace and not being representative of terrorism, but the evidence clearly suggests that the majority of terrorism, as it shows, it's coming from Muslim majority countries and Muslim organizations. How did this happen? How did this situation come about? In 2015, 30,000 people from around the globe traveled to Syria to join with ISIS. 30,000 people. Many of them from Europe. Many of them from Europe. From 85 countries they traveled, but many of them came from Europe. Now this is bizarre. Many people around the world, we have a massive immigration crisis, are trying to go to Europe, trying to go to America, and you've all seen the news, immigrants on the borders. And then you have all these thousands and thousands from France and Germany and UK all traveling to join with ISIS. This is such a strange phenomenon. Why is this happening? So one of the things I did in my book was published in 2017, called The Radical Origins, Why We Are Losing the Battle Against Islamic Extremism. One of the things I do in my book is try to examine this phenomena. Why are young people becoming radicalized? Why are young Muslims? And we've all heard various different reasons. But the reality is that each individual is different. There is no one single reason why young people become radicalized. Each one of them has their own cocktail of reasons that are pushing them. And those cocktails of reasons vary from individual to individual. There are as many reasons as there are radicals themselves. The way I look at it, the way I try to examine it in my book, is from a scientific perspective. I look at it like an economist would look at it. I divide it into push and pull factors. Push and pull. What's pushing these people and what's pulling them? It's like supply and demand. What are these factors? So the push factors is the supply. These are what make people vulnerable to extremism, to terrorism. What makes these people vulnerable? And there's a multitude of reasons. One of the things I found very interesting is that joining ISIS or any extremist organization offers you instant redemption. Instant redemption. What do I mean? If you look at the profile of some of these radicals, and they're all very varied, but you see that the majority of them, they come from a very particular kind of background. The majority of them are unemployed. They've had problems with drugs. They've had problems in and out of prison. They don't have a girlfriend. They have problems with their family. So they're kind of almost, you could say, failures in society. They're outcasts in society. And most of us, we will not know what that feels like. We are here today at the Ankara Paris lecture. We are the elite people. We will not know what it feels like to be in that situation when you are essentially nothing, when you are a nobody. And what do you have to be to go from being a nobody to being a somebody? You get on a flight, you cross the border into Syria, and in one instant, you are transformed from being a nobody into a warrior of God. You were nothing, you're unemployed in prison, and now you're a warrior of God. Instantly, 24 hours, your instant redemption. This is very attractive. A key factor in all of these radicals, the second factor, is identity politics, is the need to belong to something. To belong to something. Why do young people in Los Angeles join gangs and do horrible things which they would never do individually? It's because they want to belong to something, and ISIS, Daesh offers them a family. You cross that border, you've gone from being nobody to being somebody, and then all of a sudden, you are one of the brothers. You are one of us. We're a family, and this belonging, need for belonging, is a critical human necessity. Another key factor, and I've heard this from a number of journalists, is the entire attraction of actually having sex slaves. For many of these people, they come from conservative families, and women are an enigma to them. They just don't understand. And what's easier than going out and getting some women that you can then control in that fashion? Women who have caused so much frustration in your life because you've never had a girlfriend and you can't get married because you can't afford it. Then all of a sudden, all you do is have to buy them. This is a big attraction to many of them. Another key factor is the propaganda. We've all know about the ISIS videos, the beheadings and the killings and so on. But you know the majority of their videos, 92% of their videos are not violent. We don't see those ones because they don't get any media coverage, but 92% of ISIS videos are not violent. They actually show you people in a very harmonious utopian setting. Families going out on picnics, children having Quran competitions and winning awards. It's a very utopian environment, and this is attractive to a lot of people that look, this is the kind of environment that you can live in. The violence is also attractive for some people. And if you watch some of these videos, and I've seen some of them, you see a jeep of ISIS fighters that are driving through the desert, 60 miles an hour. They all have their guns blazing, and the nasheed are blazing on the radio. And it's almost like a Hollywood movie. It looks like Mad Max. Now, if you're a nobody, that's very attractive. I want to be part of that. It's like a movie. It's fantastic. And most of them, you see, are also religiously illiterate. The most vulnerable people to terrorist propaganda are new converts and prisoners. These are the most vulnerable people to terrorist propaganda. Then obviously many of them have foreign policy grievances. They blame the West, they blame other countries for the problems in their own country. These are all what I call push factors. These make people vulnerable to ISIS ideology. But none of these factors, taken individually or collectively, are unique to Muslims. Young people from all over the globe suffer from these things. In my city in Chicago, it's got the highest murder rate in the United States. In 2016, over 760 people were killed by gun violence in Chicago. That's more people than in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan were killed in Chicago. And I used to teach at the University of Chicago, where a lot of this violence in that neighborhood in Hyde Park would actually happen. None of them become suicide bombers. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Japan and interned all the Japanese in the Second World War. None of them became, killers and suicide bombers. Muslims, immigrants, a black African immigrant faces the same amount of discrimination in Italy and France than as a Muslim. This is completely unique to Muslims. Let me tell you this, suicide bombing and killing of innocent people is unique. This ideology is unique to Sunni Muslims. It's unique to Sunni Muslims. Not even the Shia, who have pioneered suicide bombing, who pioneered these kinds of attacks, do this to the general public. This idea that we are at war with all of humanity, that no matter where you are you are in Pakistan or you are in Paris. Get in a vehicle and just mow down as many people as you can. And when you are finished mowing them down, take a knife and kill as many people as you can. We are at war with all of humanity. We are at war with the nation state. We want to bring down the nation state. This is unique to Sunnis. When the Shias undertake suicide bombing, whether it's Amal or Hezbollah or other organizations, they do it for narrow tactical reasons on the battlefield. And they're always controlled by a larger organization. This idea that we're at war with everybody is a unique Sunni idea. So why is that the case? We have to look beyond the push factors that I mentioned. We have to look at the pull factors. And the pull factor is the ideology. The ideology. And the ideology is such that you need all these push factors, this cocktail, to be manipulated in a way that you can then pull these people in with the ideology that converts them into violent extremism. This is the reality. So where did this ideology come from? Where did this jihadism come from? From my own experience and my own research, I have traveled around the globe and I have seen many of this firsthand. I firmly believe that much of this extremist ideology, the intellectual foundations of this, has been laid by the extremist militant Wahhabism and Salafism that has been perpetuated around the globe by various countries that are perpetuating and spreading this ideology. Now, I am not saying that Salafism or Wahhabism itself is violent. What I am saying is that it lays the intellectual groundwork for then to build up to violent extremism, and then to go from that onto violent extremism is a very small step. The intellectual foundation of Wahhabism is to divide the world into two parts, Darul Harb and Darul Islam. And if you are not in the correct party, then you are technically part of Darul Harb. It consists of three principal elements. It is a desire to purge Islam of all innovations, that we must remove all the bid'ah from Islam. It is a strict literal interpretation of the Islamic text, and it's revived the tradition. It has revived the tradition of declaring Muslims that are not within your close vicinity as apostates, to do takfir on them, to say and excommunicate them, as you say. So once you have laid this kind of foundation, you have essentially dehumanized everybody that is not within your close circle. It is a very easy step to then go from that to start supporting violent extremism. And I have seen this myself firsthand. One of the countries that was actually sent the most fighters to ISIS was Kosovo. Kosovo. This was a country that was saved by NATO from a genocide. This was a country that wanted to build a statue of Tony Blair in their square because he was so popular. This was a country that named many of their children, they named them Tony Blair because people were so proud of what Tony Blair did for their country. It also then sent, the most fighters to ISIS by proportion of population. How did that come about? It came about because the Salafist ideology invested very heavily in the education system after the war. They built mosques, madrasas, and so on, and laid this foundation. And I've seen this myself. In 2003, I went to Bosnia, and my friend and I were starting a charity there to sponsor Bosnian students to come to the West to undertake education and then go back to Bosnia to then work in civil society. When the first trip I made to Bosnia, I remember it explicitly. Every institution that we visited was begging us for money, was begging us to help us. You have to help us. Our buildings are falling apart. We can't pay teachers. We don't have anything. You have to assist us. As the years went on, I noticed they were less and less interested in our money. They weren't interested in us funding this operation. The reason why is because international elements from the Gulf countries are turned up and built these massive mosques, mega mosques in these little towns. And I've seen with my own eyes the entire environment in this place change. Men were now, young European blue-eyed men were now wearing the long thawb, and females had started wearing the face veil. And it became more and more segregated and more anti-Semitic and misogynist, and it became more and more detrimental to society. But this is essentially how this ideology is spread. Turkey is a country that has not experienced this to the same extent. And this is another very interesting question. Why not? How many people from Turkey went to join ISIS? The numbers from 2014, 2015 suggest 1,300. 1,300. And the majority of them were Turkish citizens from other conflicts. So they had people that had fought in Afghanistan and Bosnia and Kashmir and Chechnya, and they couldn't come back to Turkey, so they all went to Syria. So many of them were not direct from Turkey. Now, why is this? Turkey is a Sunni country. It borders Syria. You'd expect a lot more to go. The reason why I believe is because Turkish Muslims are very comfortable with their Islam. And this is officially the solution to this problem, is that people have to be immunized against these radical ideas by traditional Islamic education. Now, this may not surprise an audience like this. I assume the majority of you are Muslim, but I have given briefings to various ministers around the globe, including the National Security Council in the United States and elsewhere, and even in Europe, particularly the Eastern European countries, when I gave briefings to some of their ministers, and I tell them the solution to terrorism over the long term is to use traditional Islamic education to immunize and inoculate these young people against a radical narrative. So when they are exposed to these radical ideas, they can recognize it for the perversion that it actually is. And for most of them, this is completely the opposite of what they are thinking, because they believe that there is something intrinsically wrong with Islam. There is something wrong with the doctrine of Islam that has to be removed. And the only way we will tackle this problem is to get Muslims out of the mosque and make them more secular. Whereas I am arguing the opposite, that people have to be comfortable. People have to be comfortable and people have to be confident of their Islamic identity and the Islamic position. And this is something where Turkey has excelled. Turkey has probably the longest tradition of Sunni Islam. You were literally the world leaders when it came to Islamic learning for centuries. And you are very comfortable with your Islamic identity, which has immunized you against these ideas. So those ideas have not been able to penetrate into your society at large. Now, why am I telling you this? The reason I'm telling you this is because before you can tackle a problem, you have to acknowledge the problem exists. And this is a mistake that many Muslims make, Muslim leaders around the globe. They simply don't acknowledge that this is a problem, that terrorism is actually the ideology is the principal pull factor that converts all these grievances. They will tell you something else about Western foreign policy, and I understand Western foreign policy is sometimes very dysfunctional. They talk about poverty and jobs and everything, and that's all very important, and we should do all of those things as a society. We should create more jobs, we should get rid of poverty, and we should try to lobby for better foreign policy. But behind that, the pull factor is the ideology that converts all of these grievances and vulnerabilities into violent extremism. And it's the ideology that you have to tackle. This is a critical factor. And this problem is only going to get much worse. The biggest problem facing the Muslim world today, and in fact the globe in general today, is the demographic problem. The demographic problem. What do I mean by this? The current population of the world stands at about 7 to 7.2 billion people. Over the next 40 years, this is going to rise to over 9.5 billion people. 9.5 billion. There will be more people alive in 40 years than have ever lived in the entire history of the human race. But the most interesting thing about this trend, the demographic change, is that the areas in which this population explosion is going to occur are the areas that are least able to sustain that population explosion, that population growth. Countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Yemen, the population is going to double. And countries like Liberia, Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the population is going to triple. Most of these states, as you probably realized, are weak and failed states. Most of these people are then going to be young people. The majority of population in all of these countries are going to be young, and they will have basic needs: food, housing, education, employment. And when those needs are not met, they can be easily attracted to violence and civil unrest. So unless we start tackling this problem urgently now, we will see this exploding on a much larger scale, and it will get completely out of control. Already in the world, we have the largest number of refugees that we've ever had, ever in history. There's 68.5 million refugees around the globe. And this is only expected to increase because of climate change, demographical changes, and resource shortages, which we will see. Whether that's going to be peak oil, countries then running out of oil, water shortages, or other issues. Refugees are only going to increase. Out of 68.5 million refugees, 70% of those refugees are Muslims. 70%. We are the largest refugee population in the world. In 2013, I visited Turkey, and I was taken to Gaziantep and Kilis by the Governor Dalmaz, who showed me around the Syrian refugee camps. And I've been to many of the refugee camps, the ones in Jordan and Macedonia and Greece. I've visited a lot of these refugee camps. And I was in huge admiration, the amount of effort and money that Turkey had put in to assist these Syrian refugees. Syria is unfortunately one of the great disasters of foreign policy of our time. I believe it's probably the biggest foreign policy disaster that the West has ever made, much bigger than Iraq or Afghanistan or anything else that you may consider. This is by far the greatest foreign policy disaster, and it happened principally because of President Obama. Now, you cannot blame the US administration. It was President Obama exclusively that decided not to intervene in Syria. It was his decision. It was not the decision of the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs, the Pentagon, or anybody else. This was his personal decision, and he now has to suffer the consequences because he was completely inexperienced in foreign policy. In foreign policy, when you do nothing, it is still doing something. And when you leave a vacuum, that vacuum is then filled by the likes of Russia or Iran or other entities will come in and now fill that vacuum. Now, the entire apparatus in the Middle East is now changing. The entire power dynamics is now very slowly shifting. The gravity is now shifting. What do I mean by this? If you are a Middle Eastern dictator, or if you're an African dictator, or an authoritarian ruler anyway, and you are an ally of the United States, and then you look at what happened to Hosni Mubarak, who's an ally of the United States. You look at what happened at Ben Ali in Tunisia, who's an ally of the United States. When their regime was threatened, the United States did nothing. Bashar al-Assad, whose father Hafiz al-Assad, have been Soviet allies for decades, for a generation. And when their regime was threatened, what happened? Putin sent in aircraft. He sent in troops as advisory. He put boots on the ground to prop up his regime. Now, if you're a Middle Eastern or African dictator or somewhere else, and now your primary concern is regime survival and to stay in power, where would you look? The United States or Putin? And now we are beginning to see the shift occurring. The United States has now vacated the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East, and Putin is now emerging as having played his hand very well. And we can see this in Sudan, for example. The regime of Bashir is now being threatened, and Putin is there now sending military forces under the guise of being private contractors to assist his regime. And he will become a client of the Russians, without a doubt, because he has nowhere to go. He's a wanted international war criminal, President Bashir, so he will, he has no choice. He will simply become a client, and this will be a reintroduction of Russia into the North African sphere. This is the unfortunate reality that Syria has left. And I was very, very supportive of the Turkish government taking a very strong stance against Bashar al-Assad and to ask for his removal when he was still trying to regain control over all of Syria. Now, the unfortunate reality is, and we cannot escape reality, that Bashar al-Assad has emerged victorious, and it is only a question of time before he consolidates all of the territory, or he'll either consolidate all the territory, or he will leave pockets of ISIS here and there and others to continue to demonstrate to the West and to the Americans and to the Europeans that, look, I'm still fighting ISIS, I need your help. You need me to keep these people in bay, otherwise they're going to grow again and emerge. You need me for this purpose. He's played his hand quite well. The Americans played it very, very poorly, and this is the unfortunate reality. Another unfortunate reality is that as long as he is still in control, Syrian refugees will not return to Syria. Why would they? What is going to be his number one priority? Bashar al-Assad's number one priority will be to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Nobody ever threatens his regime again. This is number one priority. It has to be. And how will he do this? He will do this by setting an example for the rest of people. Anybody that dared to stand up to him, anybody that dares to even have an inkling of standing up to him will be made a very, very thorough example of. And we've already seen that. Many refugees that are returning are being killed. Many refugees that are returning are disappearing. He's emptying out his prisons. His Saidna prison has even created a crematorium to burn bodies because of the large number of people that he's killing every single day. Mass graves, satellite imagery shows mass graves. He's cleaning out all the opposition, any potential opposition to him. And this is the deeply unfortunate consequence of foreign policy inexperience and foreign policy inaction. And like I said, I was very supportive of the Turkish government. I wrote dozens and dozens of op-eds in various publications to support the position of the Turkish government, and I certainly hope that they will continue with this position of opposing Bashar al-Assad. And it's very telling, the degradation of the Muslim world, in which when you initially seen what happened in Europe, in Bosnia and Kosovo, European leaders made sure that those war criminals that were responsible for the genocide in Bosnia and Kosovo were brought to justice. They did not rest until Milosevic, Karadzic, and others were brought to The Hague. And then you have the situation in Syria. Bashar al-Assad has consolidated his power, and Arab countries, Muslim countries are now lining up one after the other to reopen their embassies and reintegrate him into the Arab League. And as if 500,000 people who he murdered count for nothing. This is the unfortunate reality that we live in. There are, I think, 3.2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. A massive number. And I visited some of these camps. But this is not the largest refugee camp in the world. The largest refugee camp in the world is the camp in Bangladesh, which is my second part of what I want to speak about. The camp in Bangladesh is hosting 1.2 million Rohingya refugees. This is the largest refugee camp in the world. And I have been there many times, and it is a bizarre situation. You can climb the highest hill in Cox's Bazar, the highest hill, and look all around you, and all you see is a sea of humanity. As far as the eye can see, it's just people everywhere living in mud and squalor. These are the Rohingya refugees. They have been described by the United Nations as the most persecuted minority in the world. The most persecuted minority in the world. And there's lots of groups that can claim that title, that we are the most persecuted, but the Rohingya have been described by the United Nations as the most persecuted minority in the world. I wrote a book on the Rohingya genocide, which was published in 2015, before the current crisis erupted. And I will just tell you very quickly how I got involved with that. I read somewhere that the Rohingya are the most persecuted minority, that they are the forgotten people. So I tried to find out more about them. Who are these Rohingya? Where are they coming from? Why are they being persecuted? And I was surprised that there was absolutely nothing. There was nothing out there. There was no campaigns. There was no policy briefings. There wasn't a single book written about these people. Not a single book in the whole world about these people that are facing this genocide. There was no celebrities endorsement. There was nothing. So I spent 2 years writing various op-eds in different publications. Then I decided to make a trip to the region. I first went to Bangladesh, and I visited the camps in Bangladesh. I then went to Myanmar the same year, 2013, 2014, and I was smuggled into the camps in Myanmar, in Burma, to gather evidence. And when I came out, I put all this evidence together, and my book was published on that topic. So how did this happen? How did the Rohingya become the most persecuted minority in the world? To understand this, we need to take a quick step back into history. Back to the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded what was at that time British Burma. It was British Burma, it was a British colony. The majority Buddhist population supported the Japanese invaders, thinking that the Japanese are going to be victorious against the British. And then if we support the Japanese, we will become independent from the British. So the Buddhists supported the Japanese. The Rohingya minority supported and stayed loyal to the British colonial masters. So when the country did become independent in 1948, there was bad blood between the two people. The Buddhists looked at the Rohingya to say, well, you didn't support us during our time of need. And the Rohingya looked at the Buddhists in the same way, that they were not supportive of them. There was bad blood between the two people. There was suspicion between the two people. But despite that, there was calm. There was relative calm in society up until 1962. In 1962, the army chief decided to do a coup. His name was General Ne Win, and he tried to implement what he called the Burmese Road to Socialism. This was a communist manifesto, which was a complete economic disaster. So he did what a lot of authoritarian dictators do in that situation. When things go wrong in society, you try to find scapegoats. Who can I blame? And the Rohingya minority, who were already looked at with suspicion, who were already different. They had a different language, different religion, different skin color, different features. They were a perfect minority of choice to blame this on, that these people are responsible for your problems. Very similar to what we see in Europe. Who's responsible for the economic decline? Well, these immigrants are coming and taking your jobs. Immigrants in many countries are less than 1%, but when economics goes wrong, who's responsible? All these immigrants, these Muslims, these foreigners, interference from other parties are responsible for all of this. You blame others. This is what he did, General Ne Win. He blamed the Rohingya. He passed a number of laws which culminated in the 1972 Citizenship Act, which stripped all the Rohingya of their nationality and made them the largest stateless people in the world. And then slowly, they started interning them into camps, placing them under restrictions. They couldn't vote, they couldn't stand for election, they couldn't go to universities, hospitals wouldn't treat them, and they were then slowly confined to these massive, huge concentration camps and completely disenfranchised. Now, one of the things I do in my book is to look at the veracity of these accusations. You know, the main claim that is made against the Rohingya is that this word, Rohingya, this is what the Buddhists say, this word Rohingya is a manufactured word. This word did not exist in history. The Bengalis came from Bangladesh in 1952, and they created this word Rohingya to give themselves an identity. But these people are all illegal Bangladeshis, and they should go back to Bangladesh. So one of the things I do in my book is to look at the veracity of this accusation. And I dug up documents From the Indian National Archive in New Delhi, I got original British documents, British Empire documents, dated from 1826, from 1729, written by a British civil servant called Sir Clive Patten, Sir Charles Patten, who very clearly states that 1 in 3 people in this region are Rohingya origin. One thing that the British were very good at is that you realize why the British controlled 1/4 of the world. There was a time in which they controlled 1/4 of the world's population, is that they were masters at administration. Before they colonized an area, they would literally send in scholars and civil servants to understand the tribes, understand the power structures, understand the clans, understand the people and the families, who's got power, who doesn't have power. This is before, decades and decades before they would actually come and colonize it. These were areas that didn't even exist on maps. Places like Burma, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they didn't exist even on maps, but they would have these people go and study everything. They're masters at this, master administrators. So you look at the British documents, it clearly says the Rohingya, it clearly states. So this accusation against the Rohingya is completely false. It does not stand up to historical scrutiny. One of the questions I get asked most often is that, how could Buddhists, this is now officially a genocide. The United Nations Fact-Finding Mission reported that this is a genocide. How could Buddhists engage in genocide? Surely not. Buddhists are people that even when they don't even kill insects. Even when they have bad thoughts, you have to cleanse yourself. How could Buddhists engage in massacring people and children and burning them alive? How is this possible? Well, the Buddhism they follow in Myanmar is not the Buddhism that you and I may be familiar with. It is not the Buddhism of the Dalai Lama. They don't recognize the Dalai Lama. Many of them think that the Dalai Lama was a fraud. It's a form of Buddhism called Theravada Buddhism, which can be very militant in its nature. Now, you listen to some of the sermons of the Buddhist monks. They're all on YouTube, and you can watch them, and I've watched some of them and had them translated. It's very clear, openly, they're saying, one of the most senior monks is an individual called Sitagu. He's giving a lecture to a room full of army officers, and they're all sitting on the floor, and he's sitting on this big chair, and he's telling them about the story of a king who killed 2 people, and he couldn't sleep at night because he was so concerned that he's murdered 2 people. And the Buddhist monks at that time had insight into how the king was feeling because they had special powers. And so they went to the king in the middle of the night and they said to him that, look, we are aware that you are having difficulty sleeping because you killed these 2 people. But those people were not Buddhists, so they were only half human. They were only half human. So the implication to this room full of army officers is very clear. Non-Buddhists are only half human. Very clear. Many of them believe that the Rohingya have been reincarnated from snakes and insects. So when you kill them, you're not killing humans, you're killing vermin. This is how the Buddhists justify this. One of the most common questions, another question I get asked is, in my book, I claim that this genocide has been going on for 50 years. This is a slow motion, a slow burning genocide up until recently. This was a slow. So why, Dr. Ibrahim, why is this happening in 2017? If you're saying this has been going on for 50 years, why all of a sudden this crisis has erupted in 2017? It is, historians of genocide will tell you, it is very common for the perpetrators and organizers of a genocide to undertake a dry run, to undertake a test run, to try to examine what is going to be the reaction of the international community to this. What is going to be the reaction of local actors? Or can we get away with this? Can we take this up to a different level? The military in Myanmar undertook a dry run of this in October 2016. In October 2016, the military in Myanmar invaded a number of villages, which they burnt to the ground. They murdered a number of people, they raped lots of women, and they expelled 120,000 Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh. And the military learnt 3 critical lessons from this exercise. The first lesson that they learnt is that Aung San Suu Kyi, the newly elected leader, the Nobel laureate, the Aung San Suu Kyi, defends the military in public. Aung San Suu Kyi, shields the military from all criticism in the public domain. For example, when the United Nations in March 2017 produced a report to say that 52% of Rohingya Muslims, females, had been raped. So the majority of them, 52% of them had been raped that made it to the refugee camp in Bangladesh. Aung San Suu Kyi said, this is fake rape. This is fake rape. When the BBC journalist Fergal Keane said to her that there is ethnic cleansing going on in your country, she said, ethnic cleansing is too strong a term to use for this. Both sides are equally to blame. So drawing a moral equivalence between the aggressor and the victim, which is the equivalent of saying, do you know both the Nazis and the Jews were to blame for the Holocaust? Drawing a moral equivalent. Both sides are to blame. When the United Nations produced a report, the United Nations Humanitarian Mission produced a report saying that we need full access to Myanmar, we need a full fact-finding mission. It was Aung San Suu Kyi's office that blocked the UN from coming to the country. Even though she does not control the military, she is the foreign minister of that country, and she controls the visas, and she blocked the military, the UN from coming to the country. So this is the first lesson that the military learned, is that Aung San Suu Kyi is on our side. She will defend the military against any criticism in the public domain. The second lesson that they learned is that the military, which was very unpopular in Myanmar, suddenly became very popular after this exercise against the Rohingya. The military, which was forced to have elections in the first place because they were so unpopular, suddenly became seen as the defenders of Buddhist values against these invading Muslim hordes from Bangladesh. So the military suddenly became very popular. And the third thing that they learned is that despite all the evidence, ethnic cleansing, genocide, rape camps, the military chief, General Min Aung Hlaing, was still given a VIP invitation to Europe. Europe still gave him a VIP invitation. So there was no consequence to his actions. Germany and Holland literally rolled out a red carpet for him. And I wrote to their ambassadors to tell them that this army chief is now traveling around the globe to rebuild his military for a massive offensive in the Rohingya camps. And those letters I published online 3 months before the crisis erupted. I published them on the Huffington Post. So the military realized in 2016 from these 3 critical lessons that we can take this up, we can actually execute the final solution and just get rid of the Rohingya once and for all from our land. And this is exactly what they did. This comes to the question of Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi is a Nobel laureate. She's a Nobel laureate. You know, she's one of the most famous citizens in the world. Multiple awards from Amnesty and everybody else. Why is she behaving in such a fashion? This has been a real conundrum to policymakers. I've met policymakers in the West, in the United States, in Europe, who know her, who have met her, who campaigned for her, and they're totally baffled. What's going on? Why Aung San Suu Kyi Nobel Peace Prize? And now she's involved in, facilitating genocide. This is not heard of before. Nobody's done this before. I believe the reason why is because, and I wrote an article on this in Newsweek, how we were seduced by Aung San Suu Kyi. And for this article, I interviewed 6 people who knew Aung San Suu Kyi personally for decades. One of them was started the campaign of Free Aung San Suu Kyi. Another one used to smuggle papers to her in prison at risk to himself. Another one was an Australian member of parliament who was the first Westerner to meet with her when she was released from house arrest. All of them told me on the record, Aung San Suu Kyi, she's always been like this. She is a Burma Buddhist nationalist who believes that Burma is a country only for the Buddhists and the Muslims do not belong here. And the Muslims should leave. She has always had those beliefs. But we in the West, we have ignored her. We have ignored these signs. Why? Because, you see, we in the West, we have our own needs. We like to have our heroes on a pedestal. We like to have our heroes high up, untarnished. We love our heroes. It's like Hollywood. We like to have our heroes are wonderful, our superheroes are going to save the day. Nobody wants to hear about the shortcoming of our heroes. Nobody wants to hear about Martin Luther King and his adultery. Nobody wants to hear about the shortcomings of Nelson Mandela and how in his early days he was actually a terrorist. Nobody wants to hear about Mother Teresa and some of her other practices or Gandhi. No. We like to have our heroes to be pure and on a pedestal. And she is the best hero, Aung San Suu Kyi. Look at her. Oxford educated, the daughter of one of the founding generals of Burma, educated at Oxford, speaks the Queen's English. She's beautiful. She's articulate. Nobel Peace Prize. This is fantastic. We love this. You know, she came to the West, and we make this mistake over and over again. She comes to the West. She's been educated here. Now she's going to go back to her own country, her own backward country, and she's going to make her country into like our country. We're going to civilize these people, and this is how we will civilize them. And we make this mistake over and over again. Do you remember Saif al-Gaddafi, PhD from the London School of Economics? He's going to be the change of the Gaddafis that are going to transform the country. Then he threatened to murder everybody in Benghazi. Or Saif al-Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad, the London-trained ophthalmologist who's been quoted by Tony Blair as the great reformer with his beautiful London wife, Asma. You know, he's going to go back and transform his country. He's going to be the great democratic reformer. Then he turned out to be one of the great mass murderers of our time. You know, or Kim Jong-un, educated at a Swiss boarding school. He loves basketball. He loves Disneyland. Now he's threatening us all with nuclear annihilation. We make this mistake over and over again. We think people that have come to the West, have tasted Western democracy, are going to go back to their countries and transform their country and change their backward country into our country, without realizing that these people are ideologically committed. They have an agenda. They're not going to change. And in many cases, they can't change. They cannot change because for them, in their world, it's a zero-sum game. Either you are in power or you and your tribe and your family and your clan are all dead. So you have to stay in power brutally if you have to. But we fail to realize that. So let me just tell you, why has there been, in the situation of Myanmar and the Rohingya, created the worst humanitarian crisis in the world of our generation? You know, and I met with a scholar recently, and I told him, this is the worst, in my opinion, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And he said to me, look, you know, I think the Yemen situation is worse. I think the Syrian situation is worse. And I said, look, Yemen is it's a terrible situation. There's absolutely no doubt. Syria is an absolutely terrible situation. But hopefully, one day, if God wills, these wars will end. Syria, Yemen, and these people can start rebuilding their lives. They'll go back to Yemen, they'll go back to Syria, and there'll always be Syrians and there'll always be Yemens. The Rohingya, on the other hand, have got nowhere to go back to. They are stateless. They don't have any nationality or any passport. I gave a briefing to the US senator, and he told me that, you know, what will be very powerful is if we can get some of these Rohingya to come to the US and give evidence to the US Congress about what happened. But the difficulty is none of them have any nationality or any passport. Bangladesh is not giving them a passport, so they can't even travel. These people are in a completely different situation. This is the worst humanitarian situation. So why has there been no action from the international community? And I know Turkey is a country that has taken a leading role in this in terms of trying to help and facilitate the condition, improve the situation of the Rohingya, and particularly the First Lady of Turkey, the President's wife. She has taken a leading role in this, and many of the Rohingya that I meet acknowledge that the work that the Turkish President's wife has done in this sphere. But why can't why is the international community, you know, we've said numerous times, never again will this happen, and now we have another genocide, official genocide, classified by the United Nations. Why has there been no action? There's three principal reasons for this. First of all, the Rohingya, when you meet them, they are the lowest of the low. They are the lowest of the low. There are hardly anybody amongst them with even a basic college education. Most of them have been fishermen, farmers, or laborers. The Myanmar authorities ensured that over the last 50 years that none of them have access to education, to completely disenfranchise them. And when they murder them, they make sure that they murder the imams and the teachers in the school first, This is well documented. They kill the leaders to leave them powerless. So these people cannot advocate for themselves domestically, let alone internationally. This is a real challenge for them. And, you know, all of you, this is a very sophisticated audience. You know, you're here, and many of you are policymakers. But I bet you the worst humanitarian crisis in the entire world is with Muslim Rohingya. I bet not a single one of you can name me one Rohingya person. One. Tell me one Rohingya person. No, none of you can. None of you know a single Rohingya person. If I tell you about the Palestinians, you can name me, which is a very popular cause. You can name Mahmoud Abbas. You know Mahmoud Abbas. You know Yasser Arafat. You know Edward Said, the academic. You know Gigi Hadid, supermodel. Also, you know, lots of. Do you know one Rohingya person? There is no Rohingya that have been successful. There's no Rohingya in Silicon Valley that's made an app that can say, I'm going to put $5 million of my money into a public awareness campaign for my people. There's nobody of Rohingya origin working in CNN, in the BBC, or Al Jazeera that can say, this is my pet project to raise awareness for my people. There is nobody of Rohingya origin work in the British Parliament, in the European Parliament, or even working as assistants in Brussels or Germany. There's nobody. These people are lowest of the low. They are the forgotten people. This is one of the reasons their campaign is not get any traction. So this is the first reason they cannot advocate for themselves. They are the lowest of the low. The second reason is the myth of a military coup. I have met policymakers at the highest level in the UK and in Washington, that tell me that, look, we can't take any action against Myanmar because it's a very fragile democracy. You know, they just had elections. Aung San Suu Kyi has come to power. It's a flawed democracy. It's fragile, but it's moving in the right direction. The last thing we want is the military to come back. You know, if we put too much pressure on them, the military will come back and take over the country. We don't want that, so we're not going to do anything. They've told me this explicitly. And this is a myth that's being perpetuated by Aung San Suu Kyi and her supporters. The reality is that the military in Myanmar is in the perfect position right now. They have the holy grail of politics. They have power without any accountability. The last thing they want is to take over the country and then re-invite international sanctions. This is what they don't, there's no way they want that. They're in the perfect situation. They have Aung San Suu Kyi defending them and justifying them in the public domain while they get on and, you know, enrich themselves and cleanse the country of Muslims and Rohingya. So that's the second thing, the myth of a military coup. And the third reason is China. Now, why would China be interested in Myanmar? Myanmar was one of the most closed and suspicious societies in the world. President Obama, when he was in office, visited Myanmar on 2 occasions. For any country to get a visit from the President of the United States is a big deal. They take it very seriously. Why would Obama visit Myanmar on 2 occasions? The United States is deeply concerned that as Myanmar opens up, it's going to fall under the sphere of influence of China. The entire Southeast Asia is now being reconfigured for one purpose, and that's to meet China's insatiable demand for resources. Their Belt and Road Initiative covers 60 countries. 60 countries come under the Belt and Road Initiative, which is 70% of the world's population. They are engaging in a massive exercise of, you know, essentially modern-day colonization. They are engaging in what experts call debt book diplomacy, getting countries into huge amounts of debt, which they cannot then service, and then China renegotiates and starts taking over national assets of those countries. Even country like Pakistan. Nobody wanted to come near Pakistan. China gave Pakistan $62 billion in loan through CPAC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The same thing they're doing almost in the entire region, and now extending it to Africa, pouring in massive amounts of money, giving out loans, which many of these countries cannot service. So President Obama was deeply concerned that they'll fall under this sphere of influence of China. What interest does China have in Myanmar? China has ambitions to be a global superpower. But before it can become a global superpower, it must become a regional power. And that means keeping its regional nuclear rival, India, in check. It has to keep it in check. Access to Myanmar means that China can avoid the Straits of Malacca, the long Straits of Malacca and the Indian Ocean. It can have surround India. They're already investing heavily in building military and naval bases here, completely surround India. So the US is deeply concerned about this Chinese expansion. So you have these geopolitical machinations going on between superpowers, United States, China, India, all nuclear powers. And then you have this minority group that nobody's ever heard of, they're called the Rohingya. Nobody's ever heard of these people, and you insert that into the equation. It does not fit into that equation. It does not fit into that calculation when these geopolitical maneuvers are going on between superpowers on that scale. So that's the third reason. So what's the future for the Rohingya? Now this is the difficult thing, because I don't believe there is a solution anymore. Myanmar is in negotiations with Bangladesh to take back these refugees. That is all a ruse. I don't believe they are sincere at all. And I wrote a piece in the New York Times on this when they first announced it, that this is just a game that Myanmar plays over and over again to enter negotiations that we are going to take back the Rohingya. But it is all designed to buy time until the Rohingya become a permanent fixture in Bangladesh and Myanmar gets away with it. And they've done this many times before. They did it in 92, 93, 97, 98, 2012. This is repeated exercise. I met people in the camps in Bangladesh who had been refugees 3 times. I came over in 92, I went back to Myanmar, I came over in 2000, and they've been refugees many times. They've been, and none of them want to go back now. And what are they going to go back to? Myanmar seized their land, burnt down their villages, bulldozed all their villages, and they have already redistributed the land to the locals. So what they are doing is what they call changing the facts on the ground. They've changed the facts on the ground, and they mine the border to make sure none of these refugees come back. So this is the difficulty, is that there is no solution, I believe, major solution to this problem. I believe the only way forward is to small solutions for countries like Bangladesh and others in the region to try to absorb some of these people into their own population. Now the difficulty is that these people have nothing to offer. Germany took in 1 million Syrian refugees. 1 million. Why did Germany do that? Because Germany has a declining birth rate. And they need these workers to be replenished for the economy to be successful. Angela Merkel knew this. And the Syrians are highly educated. They're highly entrepreneurial. They'll make a significant contribution to the economy. What are the Rohingya going to contribute? They're not educated. They're not entrepreneurial. There's a center in Chicago called the Rohingya Cultural Center, and there's a number of refugee families that came over and now part of this cultural center. And I spoke to the lady who's teaching them English. So she's teaching the refugees English. And she told me, she said, you know, it is so difficult to teach these people English because most of them do not even know their own language. And most of them have never held a pen. They've never held a pen. What are these people going to contribute? No country wants them. These are the most persecuted people and the forgotten people. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that the crisis in the Muslim world is multitude. It's a multitude of crises, no shortage. You do not need me, an American academic, to come to your country in Turkey to tell you about the problems of the Muslim world. You are living in a region that has been at the sharp end of those problems. With Syria or with Yemen or anything else, this is the sharp end. It's all happening here. I have to give great admiration in which that Turkey has conducted itself in this situation, and in these situations, and I hope they continue to do so and lead as an example to many other countries that this is what you do with some of these refugees. You've taken in, millions of Syrian refugees. How many have some of the other Arab Gulf countries taken in? Not many. In fact, some of them are none. Not many people are aware of this. They haven't taken in many refugees at all because the Arab countries are designed in such a way that you come to these countries. The majority of the population in some of these Gulf countries are foreigners, expats. that come to work. You come and work in this country, you earn money, and then you go back. You never become a citizen. You never become a citizen in that country. They don't want you to become a citizen, because once you become a citizen, then your children are also going to grow up in that country, and you have a stake in society, and then you want society to change. They don't want people trying to interfere in the society. You come, you work, you earn your money, and then if they want to kick you out, they kick you out. They haven't taken in any of the Syrian refugees, because if they take in Syrian refugees, they have let a lot of them overstay their visas, but they have no officially Syrian as internationally recognized as a refugee from the Refugee Convention. Why? Because these Syrian refugees are educated, they speak Arabic, they're the same religion, they have the same language. They come to your country as refugees under the Refugee Convention. They have to have a path to citizenship. You make them citizens. One generation, they'll take over the whole country. They'll literally take over the entire country, because they're much harder working than your own domestic population, which is much smaller in size and is used to now living off subsidies. This is why I have great admiration for what Turkey has done, and I certainly hope that you will continue in this endeavor. So, ladies and gentlemen, the problems in the Muslim world are so multitude. But first of all, we have to acknowledge that the problems exist in extremism, in radicalization. What are the mechanics of this? What are the pull factors that are pulling in these people? I believe it's ideology, as I've articulated. I also believe that Turkey was absolutely right in standing up to Bashar al-Assad, and I certainly hope that they will continue to do so. I certainly hope that Turkey, as it has in the past, will continue to take a leading role in the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, the Rohingya crisis, which are essentially the world is moving on from. Before I finish, I'd like to tell you that I like reading a lot of history, and I like to insert myself into history, And I think to myself, if I was alive in Germany during the Second World War, yeah, of course I would have had hidden some Jewish family in my basement or in my attic. Of course we would have all done that. We would all, helped out some of our Jewish neighbor families when the Nazis came to look for them, But I wasn't alive then. And I think, when Martin Luther King was marching in Selma against racism, of course, I would have been right there, arm in arm with Dr. King, marching with him to stand up for these rights. I would have been in that prison in Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, standing with. Of course, we would all done that. We are all morally upright characters. But I was not alive then. I am alive today. And this, what I've told you, it's happening to the Rohingya, to the Syrians. This is happening today. And I am only responsible for what's within my time and my sphere. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Uzun, hüzünlü bir ansiklopedi okumuş gibi hissediyorum ben kendimi. Sorusu olan arkadaşlar var mı? Bir konuğumuz çevirileri, Türkçe çevirileri nasıl duyacak? Teknik ekip.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yep.
Evet, bir Türkçe denemesi yapabiliriz. Acaba doğru kanalda mıyız? Duyuyor musunuz? Tamam, okey. Evet. Öndeki hanımefendiye mikrofonu uzatalım.
Fatma Benli. Sunumunuzdan ve özellikle Rohingyalı Müslümanlara ilişkin bilgilendirmeden ötürü teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi Türkçe'de çok güzel bir deyim vardır. Kuklaya değil, sahnenin arkasındaki kuklacıya bakmak gerek diye. Sonuçta Türkiye karşı karşıya kaldığı pek çok sorulara rağmen terörle mücadelede, biraz yavaş konuşayım daha iyi olacak tercümede, terörle mücadelede çok önemli, çözüm önerilerine ulaşmış bir ülke ama yakın zamana kadar bütün dünyadaki uluslararası kuruluşların da kabul ettiği üzere terörde en fazla mağdur olan ülkelerin başında Türkiye geliyor. Benim ülkemde patlayan bombalar bu ülkede üretilmedi. aynen Suriye'de,
Yeah.
Irak'ta, Afganistan'da patlayan ve insanların ölümüne yol açan bombaların İslam ülkelerinde üretilmediği gibi. Bugün dünya silah ticaretinin en fazla olduğu ülkelerin Avrupa'daki ülkeler olması gerçeği karşısında eğer silah ticaretindeki para akışının saydam olarak denetlenmesi durumunda terörle mücadelede daha fazla etkin olduğu görüşüne katılıp katılmadığını sormak istiyorum. Bir de biliyorsunuz Avrupa'da 5,5 milyondan fazla Türk var. Orada 3 kuşaktır yaşayan Türkler arasında DAEŞ'e katılanların sayısı yok denecek kadar az. Buna karşın Avrupa'da doğmuş büyümüş ya da yaşamının çok büyük bir kısmını Avrupa'da geçirmiş olan özellikle Kuzey Afrika orijinli bazı Müslümanların DAEŞ'e katıldığını görüyoruz. Ama onlar aslında Kuzey Afrika orijinli ya da Müslüman olarak tanımlanmadan önce Avrupalı olarak tanımlanması gereken kişiler. Çünkü yaşamlarının önemli bir kısmını Fransa'da, Belçika'da geçirdiler. Şu an Avrupa'da artan sağcılığın ve yabancı düşmanlığının aslında aşırıların eleman devşirmesine ve silah tüccarlarının daha fazla para kazanmasına yol açtığı gerçeğini paylaşıp paylaşmadığını öğrenmek istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkürler, çok sağ olun.
Okay. Okay. Shall we take more than one
Yes,
question?
answer.
Okay. Okay. No, I agree completely with the lady that Turkey has been a disproportionate victim of terrorism. You have more experience as victims of terrorism, even well before Daesh, everybody had even heard of Daesh, and Turkey has conducted itself with great respectability in this sphere. And I completely agree with you that Turkey has very, Turkish citizens are very small in number that have actually gone to Daesh or Al-Qaeda or anything else. And as I said in my presentation, I believe it's because Turkish Islam is highly sophisticated. It is highly modern. It provides everything that a modern human being needs. People are very comfortable with Islamic identity. And it's not just Turkey. If you look, how many Malaysians are there, for example, in Daesh, in comparison to other nationalities? Very small. Very, very small in number, because Malaysians are also very comfortable with their Islam. This is why I believe an sound Islamic identity is the best immunization, is the best inoculation against these radical ideas. Now, in terms of the money flow and the arms trade, the unfortunate reality is that many economies in the West are completely reliant on weapons trading. My country of United Kingdom, there's only essentially two parts to their economy now. There's a service industry and finance, banking, and insurance, and there's armaments. And the biggest seller of armaments is the United States. This is the reality. And with Putin's introduction into the Middle East, this was essentially a large advertising exercise for him to demonstrate Russian weaponry. And much of this weaponry that they provide to these regimes and these militias is old weaponry, so they can remodernize their kind of fleet, But the principal reason I think that there's been a massive inflow of weaponry and money is because of the Russians, and the Iranian militias that have been very significantly armed. The Hashd al-Shabi and the Hezbollah militias, tens of thousands of them have been significantly armed by the Iranians that are flooding the market with this kind of money, which is a hugely unfortunate situation because the Iranian economy is struggling so much, but they are still spending, billions of dollars on these international militias to create havoc in the region. And the same with the Russians. The Russian economy is essentially a large gas station. They don't have much else going on. The economy is the size of Sweden, but they are playing their hand very well in terms of projecting their strategic power around the region. But they don't really have much other money going on, and they're spending a lot of it on these militias and supporting these armaments, flooding the market, as you said, with these kinds of weaponry and so on.
İkinci soruyu alabiliriz. Var mı sorusu olan? Buyurun, ikinci sırada bir beyefendi var. Mikrofon kimdi arkadaşlar? Evet.
Thank you. I will ask in English, so it will be easier for you. Welcome. Thank you for thought-provoking presentation. Something related with earlier question as well. don't you think there is certain Eurocentrism or Western centrism in interpreting that? I agree, numbers, Muslims are the top victims of terrorism, but also there are, in addition to being politically incorrect, other lines of that, from Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, which are also masters in suicide bombing, to PKK, YPG, and other groups. And in that regard, do you think the Muslim world receives the support from the West when it comes to counterterrorism? And what do you think about the rise of Islamophobia and extreme right-wing extremism, which does have some terrorist acts increasingly more so in Europe? And what's the relationship? And I come to the last part of my question. What's the way out? I mean, not only for the Muslim world in general, but in terms of the relationship with Muslim countries and other countries, because the threat is global, so as it requires global cooperation. So what's coming in that regard?
Thank you very much. No, you're absolutely right. You know, and as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, the Tamil Tigers were the ones that pioneered the suicide bombing. They were the main kind of architects behind this. And not just the Tamil Tigers, during the Lebanese civil war, the organization Amal, you know, the Shia organization, also were pioneers in using car suicide bombing. But the point I was trying to make, whether it's the Tamil Tigers, Hezbollah, or Amal, or PKK, or whatever, all of these organizations, they use it as a military tactic, as a tactic on the battlefield against a military target, against a civilian target. This idea that no matter where you are, just go out and kill whoever you can find, whether in, you know, in Pakistan, or whether in Paris, or whether in, you know, wherever you may be, just kill people, yeah, in a car, just mow them down, and this is our ideology. This is unique to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is completely unique. The Tamil Tigers don't do this, neither do the, you know, Hezbollah or Amal or anybody, these organizations. This is completely unique, that we are at war with all of humanity. So I think this is a completely unique situation. In terms of assistance from Western governments in this fight against terrorism, all Western governments are fully aware of what's happening. But the question is, what are they willing to do about this? Now, the difficulty is that many of the international entities that are fueling these conflicts are critical US and European allies, and the West is not willing to stand up to them. And this is an unfortunate reality. You know, Saudi Arabia is one of the countries that spends $2 to $3 billion every year exporting their ideas around the globe through their madrasas and embassies and funding schools and institutions, exporting their you know, Salafist organization. But Saudi Arabia, and I gave a briefing to the Deputy National Security Advisor under George Bush, and he told me, he said, look, we know all of this. We know exactly what's happening, but Saudi Arabia is too important for us to even say anything about this. Why? Why is Saudi Arabia so important? Now you look, there's three countries essentially that the United States has had a very difficult relationship with, yeah? Russia, Iran, Venezuela, actually four, and North Korea, yeah? Russia, Iran, Venezuela, yeah, and North Korea. Out of those four, three are major oil exporting countries. Those three countries, Saudi Arabia assisted the United States in doing what almost 50 years of smart sanctions could not do to Iran and Venezuela. 50 years of smart sanctions, yeah? With Saudi Arabia turned on the taps and increased oil production, bringing the price of oil down. Iran could not pay its civil servants. They were forced to come to the negotiating table. The same with the Russians. And Venezuela, we can see the situation that it's in. So Saudi Arabia is far too important on the global stage to the United States as a critical ally against these entities for the US to openly criticize it. You know, and it's not just Saudi Arabia, many other countries, many other organizations are pushing these kinds of ideas. In terms of Islamophobia and some of the terrorist acts, Islamophobia certainly is on the increase. I know this because I see it every single day in my own daily life. But those that are perpetuating Islamophobia will then argue that, look, this is only a reaction to the Muslim behavior, even though I don't agree with that assessment. The right wing, the rise of the right wing, is a reaction to, you know, Muslim immigrants and I believe even the Muslim immigrants, the Syrian refugee situation was exacerbated specifically as a tactic by Putin. You know, I don't believe he created it. I believe he exacerbated the situation to flood Europe with the Syrian refugees, tactically destroying cities in Syria for the specific purpose to ensure that none of these refugees remain and are forced into Europe, and putting strain on Europe. You know, so this has been the refugee crisis is partially manufactured and exacerbated by the likes of Putin. You know, and unfortunately, the West has not been able to handle this sufficiently, significantly well enough. But the reality is that Europe has done as much as it possibly could for the refugee crisis. Countries in the region should take much more of a responsibility, particularly countries around the Syrian region.
Beyefendi var orada, verebilir miyiz?
Teşekkürler. Mehmet Kancı ben, TRT Haber'den. Sayın İbrahim'e Pakistan odaklı bir sorum olacak. Hafta başında Suudi Arabistan Veliaht Prensi Bin Selman Pakistan ziyareti sırasında 20 milyar dolarlık bir anlaşmalar dizisi imzaladı. Ve çeşitli spekülasyonlar var. Pakistan eliyle Suudi Arabistan'ın nükleer silah ve teknoloji sahibi olacağına dair. Bunun yanı sıra geçen hafta İran'ın Belucistan bölgesinde ve Hindistan'ın Cammu Keşmir bölgelerinde güvenlik güçlerine hedef alan saldırılar düzenlendi. Ve hem Tahran hem de Yeni Delhi yönetimleri şimdi Pakistan'ı bu saldırıların arkasında olmakla suçluyor. Buna paralel olarak biraz uzun oluyor ama Afganistan konusuna da değinmek istiyorum. Malum yarın Ankara'da Rusya ve Amerika Birleşik Devletleri özel temsilcilerinin Afganistan'daki barış sürecine ilişkin bir toplantıları olacak. Pek yakın bir gelecekte Taliban'ın Afganistan'da hükümet ortağı olabileceği bir profille karşılaşabiliriz. Şimdi bu profildeki bir Pakistan ve Afganistan, Güney Asya'da ve Orta Asya Türk Cumhuriyetlerinde potansiyel bir yeni insani krizlere yol açabilir mi? Ne görüyorsunuz bölgenin geleceğine ilişkin olarak?
Teşekkürler, çok sağ olun.
Thank you very much. So the visit of the Saudis to Pakistan has resulted in 15 to 20 billion dollars of Saudi investment, and this is very welcome in Pakistan because Pakistan is a country that's in huge financial difficulty. Prime Minister Imran Khan inherited an economy which was technically completely broken, and one of the reasons for that is that nobody in Pakistan pays tax. The majority of people, the wealthy people, do not pay tax. All the tax actually comes from indirect taxes, which affects the poorest the most. So it's tax on sales and imports and so on, so which everybody has to pay. But in terms of income tax, very few people in the country pay that. So that needs fundamental reform. There's always been a tacit agreement, my understanding, between the Saudis and the Pakistanis that in the eventuality that Iran gets a nuclear bomb, that Saudi Arabia will somehow get the technology or even a whole-scale bomb from Pakistan to counter and balance that threat. I believe that understanding has always been there between the two countries. Remember the Saudi military is trained very significantly by the Pakistani military. It's Pakistani senior officers that actually take a close hand in training the Saudis. So this was an understanding I believe has gone back a long time between the Saudis and the Pakistanis. In terms of the terrorist attack, India blamed Pakistan directly. I do not believe the Pakistani government or the intelligence services had any hand in this at all. The organization that claimed responsibility is an organization called Jaish-e-Mohammed. It's led by Maulana Masood Azhar. He's a terrorist on the wanted list. I don't know if his whereabouts, but the Indians claim that he is still in Pakistan. He has been arrested in the past. I believe now he's out in the open, but I don't believe that the Pakistani government would participate, or certainly the government or the intelligence services would have a hand in this terrorist operation in any way. The Afghanistan situation is very interesting because in 2009, I actually wrote a paper saying that there has to be negotiations with the Taliban and that the United States has no way of winning this war. They have spent over $1 trillion on this situation in Afghanistan, and they're actually in a worse position now. There was a time when the Taliban actually wanted to negotiate with the United States, and the US refused because they believed that they had the upper hand. And now the situation is reversed. Now the Taliban are the ones that are holding all the cards. I think the best outcome would probably, and the most realistic outcome, is that there'll be some sort of power sharing agreement between the current government and the Taliban. So far, all the negotiations that have happened between the United States and the Taliban. The Taliban does not negotiate with the Afghan government because they do not recognize the Afghan government as being legitimate. They just see them as being American puppets. So they don't even want to meet with them. But recently, I think it was only last month, they had the first meeting between the Afghan and the Taliban. So this is a very positive development. This is a situation, many experts see that, look, this isn't actually a war. It's basically a situation to manage. The US should essentially accept that they're almost like colonizers there, and they have to look at the long term just to manage the situation. I don't think that's sustainable. I think the best outcome would probably be for the US, the Taliban and the Afghan government to come to some sort of power sharing agreement, and for the US to exit out of that region. It was an unrealistic and unsustainable situation as it stood.
Nükleer silaha sahip bir Suudi Arabistan bölgedeki dengeleri ne kadar değiştirir diye ben de merak ettim. Üstüne bir...
Yeah, I didn't see the questioner, but no, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the reasons, Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, no, so, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia, who's got, unlimited wealth, is unlimited wealth and unlimited financial resources. Now, we've recently seen how President Trump seemed to be in some sort of agreement with the Saudis to provide them with nuclear technology without the knowledge of Congress. I don't know how accurate those reports are, but Saudi Arabia, without any doubt, has the financial ability and the wherewithal to start a nuclear program if it wanted to. And probably the only reason they haven't is because this will start an arms race in the region. Every country will be fully justified in starting their own nuclear weapons program, and particularly the Iranians will restart, theirs. There'll be absolutely no doubt. So this is why I think the Saudis and the Pakistanis have this tacit agreement that in the eventuality that a country like Iran gets a hold of nuclear weapons, then we will also get the technology from Pakistan and accelerate our program. It's interesting because the United Nations, the former head of the nuclear watchdog, Mohammed Al-Baradei, he said that, there's countries in the future, there'll be almost 20 countries in the future that will be what he called virtual nuclear powers. Virtual nuclear powers. And these are countries that have the technology, that have the material, and have the know-how to construct a nuclear bomb very quickly. But they will not do it until the time actually comes. So they will essentially still be signatories to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treatment, and they won't be nuclear powers, but they will be virtual powers. And he said that there will be over 20 of them in his estimation in terms of how quickly they could put together a nuclear bomb. And Saudi Arabia could easily become one of those countries. That they don't take the final step, but they have everything ready to construct an atomic weapon.
Buyurun.
İki tane sorum olacak. Bir tanesi Türkiye Cumhuriyeti'nin Cumhurbaşkanı dünya 5'ten büyüktür cümlesine hem konuğumuz hem Amerika'daki görüştüğü siyasetin haricindeki entelektüel insanların bakışı nedir? İkinci sorum, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri ile zaman zaman yaşadığımız bir takım problemlerden dolayı gerek İran ve Rusya ile yakınlaşmamız Amerika'daki siyasiler tarafından ya da diğer kesimler tarafından nasıl karşılandığını merak ediyorum. Onu sormak istedim.
Teşekkür ederim. Çok sağ olun.
So you broke up a little there. I assume when you're referring to the five, you're referring to the Security Council? Yeah. So yeah, so the Security Council is an apparatus. You know, I've only had experience with the United Nations over the last couple of years since the Rohingya crisis erupted. I've had multiple meetings with various members of the Security Council. I've had meetings with the Secretary General's office and various committees in the UN. And this has been my only experience with the United Nations. And I can tell you this openly, and I've written extensively about this. I wrote an article in the Washington Post on this, is that, in my opinion, the Security Council is completely dysfunctional. It simply does not work anymore, and it needs a significant reconfiguring. The United Nations, I've always been a firm supporter of the United Nations and what it does. Yeah? And when I'm talking about the United Nations, I'm referring to the UN agencies. UNHCR, you know, the IOM, the Organization of Migration, all these different agencies do absolutely critical work all over the globe. But the political organization, the Security Council, is completely dysfunctional. You know, I have had multiple meetings in which they've told me that, oh, we can't do this or we can't do that because of the Chinese or the Russian veto, you know. And there's one ambassador I met that told me explicitly that, look, we're not even going to try because the Chinese are going to veto this. I wrote an article on this in which I believed, and I was referring to the situation of the Rohingya, that in cases of genocide, the Security Council should have a very modest reform. So I'm not asking it to be abolished or, you know, changed, but a very modest reform. In cases of genocide, instead of one veto, there should be two vetoes. Two vetoes. If there is one veto, the decision of genocide should go to the Secretary General, and he should make the decision. So if one country vetoes, then the Secretary General should then make a decision. So this is a very modest reform, I think, that they could probably absorb. But otherwise, the Security Council, it not only is dysfunctional in terms of providing legitimacy, all you need, if you want to carry out genocide, you want to carry out mass killings, all you need is a power to cover for you. Whether it's China, Russia, US, France, you need one of the members of the Security Council to provide you with cover, and then nothing becomes legitimate. No country can take action because it's not been sanctioned by the Security Council, by the UN. So, but that action, even if you're doing something positive to helping people, to refugees, or trying to fix a situation, everything becomes illegitimate because it's not been actioned. So it becomes a preventative mechanism. And so it's part of your second question. So first of all, yeah, so I agree that the UN Security Council should be fundamentally reformed. It needs fundamental reformation. I don't believe that's a realistic proposition because none of the five will want to give up any of their power, the permanent five. So I think modest reforms, like I mentioned, in cases of genocide, having a double veto or Secretary General making a decision, these are modest reforms that could be absorbed. So in terms of your second question, the United States, you know, Turkey and the region becoming closer allies to the US, to Iran and Russia. This in the United States is seen as in a very strange fashion because Turkey is seen as being a critical ally in NATO, as a critical NATO ally that then reaches out to other countries. And many of the US public do not understand this, you know, but when the United States, as I mentioned before, they have vacated the space and left countries like Turkey and other countries in the region to deal with these problems, like whether it's in Syria or elsewhere, then countries like Turkey have to behave in their own interest, whatever that may be. You know, the US has now vacated this massive sphere of influence in the Middle East. So, you know, it's understandable that Turkey has to now work with all partners to be as effective as possible to further their own interests. And I think that's a completely acceptable position.
Sayın Acet buyurun. Sizi burada görmek ne güzel. Hoş geldiniz.
Teşekkür ederim. My question will be in English. Actually, I will try to ask my question in English. First of all, thank you very much for your valuable speech. And it's been an honor for me to be here. Actually, when I listened to you, when I listened to first part of your speech, I remembered one of my conversations with a socialist politician here in Turkey. He said 30 or 40 years ago, there were no terrorist organizations named as Al-Qaeda. And just several years ago, so there were no terrorist organizations named as ISIS or Daesh. So when we diverted as a question, we asked each other why. He had his own answer to the question, and I had my own answer to the question. Now I wonder your own answer to the question. Why there were no such terrorist organizations several years ago as Daesh or ISIS, and 30 to 40 years ago, Al-Qaeda? Thank you.
Yeah, no, so it's a very good question and a very pertinent one for the current situation. The reality is that one of the things I did in my book, The Radical Origins, is to look at where many of these ideas actually came from. And there's a very actually clear path in terms of some of the intellectual underpinnings of organizations like Al-Qaeda, the jihadism, where it actually emerged from. And I look at the rift of different ideologies and essentially where it emerged. Now, one of the challenges we have is that we do not, my central thesis is that the ideology is a central problem in all of this. We can look at the underlying factors, but the ideology has continuously evolved, and because we have never tackled the root ideology of extremism, of Islamic extremism, it will continue to evolve into something else. So Al-Qaeda is not essentially the first, but it certainly evolved, because some of the tactics used by Al-Qaeda was used by Islamic Jihad in Egypt back in the 70s and 80s. Exactly the same tactics, exactly the same thinking, and it simply evolves into Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda evolves into ISIS, Boko Haram, and because we do not deal with the ideology, the root ideology, it will simply evolve. Now with ISIS, even though they have lost their territory, we have not defeated them. ISIS was very different than Al-Qaeda because they measured their success by the amount of territory they controlled. And unlike Al-Qaeda, which essentially measured success by the amount of terrorist attacks it took around the globe. So even though it loses its territory, it is now reverting back to the same tactics as Al-Qaeda, which is to inspire self-starter cells around the globe. So many of the ISIS-inspired attacks around the globe, these people have had no contact, physical contact with ISIS leaders or recruiters. Many of them are just inspired, what they call self-starter cells. They watch the videos, they learn how to do it, and then they go out and commit a terrorist act. So ISIS has now changed from an organization that physically controls territory to one that has become much more like Al-Qaeda. And until we take care of the root ideology, we will see, and I can put this on record, within the next few decades, it will evolve into something else. And on each iteration, it seems to be getting more and more dangerous. ISIS had absolutely no rules of engagement at all in comparison to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda still had some rules and ethics. ISIS had absolutely none. It just continues to evolve until, first of all, we acknowledge what the problem is the root ideology, and we acknowledge the source of the problem. And this is not a battle that we can win very quickly. This is a generational battle, a generation. We are fighting for the root and the soul of Islam against these extremists and radicals. And as I mentioned in the earlier part of my presentation, the reasons for this are multitude. The reasons for this are multitude, and we need to tackle the root ideology. Otherwise, the problem is huge. I went through the numbers from the Global Terrorism Index. This is a Muslim problem, and the Muslim world has to take a lead on tackling this.
İki saate yaklaşıyoruz. Son bir tane soru alalım ve daha sonra kokteylimize geçelim istiyorum. Arkada bir konuğumuz var.
Thank you very much for giving us a chance to listen to you and learning much about your ideas. And from now on, by tomorrow morning, we will know more about Myanmar. We will know about Rouhani out there. We will know about the Chinese are not good for them, and European Union is not doing anything for them. These are all right. It's very common expression that we all know. It's from Albert Einstein. He says, I want to know what the God taught. Rest are details. I want to know what the Muslim leaders think say and go on doing for their folks, for their people after tomorrow? Rest, aren't they details? Right?
Yep.
Now, would you mind telling me a Muslim leader who is living as Quran says, but ruling his country as universal laws? Equality, empathy, sharing with his people, and being same far to his old roots. Tell me a Muslim leader, as I wish, I hope to see the rest of my life. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. So the first part of your question is, it is not my function to tell you to do anything. Yeah, that's up to you. Whatever you do, you are responsible for your own action. It is not I'm not in a position to tell anyone to do anything. I am simply here to try to educate in areas that you may not be familiar with. The second part of your question, do I know a Muslim leader that rules by Quranic values? I don't know, because I don't know enough about Quranic values, and I don't believe personally that is a requirement. I don't necessarily believe that the requirement is a Muslim leader has to rule by Islamic values. I think there are basic values of justice and equality which are sufficient for Muslim leaders to adopt for the populations. The bar is relatively low for most of the Muslim world. There's only two developed, according to the World Health Organization, there's only two developed Muslim countries in the world, Turkey and Malaysia. So the bar is relatively quite low for what some of these leaders have to do. Most of these countries are completely rife with corruption. These are people living in abject poverty, and the leaders are siphoning off billions of, not even, take a few $1 million and buy yourself an apartment in London, but they're siphoning off billions and billions of dollars in corruption. Most of these countries, so the requirement of these leaders is relatively quite low, I believe, for them to even meet the basic the basic criteria of being just rulers. Whether they rule by the Quran or any other values is not my concern, and it's certainly, I don't think it's my motivation. It's not my motivation either.
Thank you very much. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz alkışlarınızla. Sağ olun.